This is your video on Elie Wiesel and his book Night, which is, I imagine, a book that many of you have already read. It's very popular. It's very well known to be taught at the high school and college level, so you may have experience reading it on your own or reading it in a class before. Night is, in fact, one of the most widely translated books in the world, translated into some 30 different languages at this point. We're going to be talking a little bit about Wiesel, a little bit about the Jewish ethnicity and experience in the 20th century, and a little bit about the Holocaust. If you don't know, Wiesel is writing about his experience surviving the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp during the Second World War. In this book, which is a memoir, we learn of he and his father's struggle. He also has a mother and some sisters who were separated from him during the concentration camp experience. His mother and father would not survive the war, and his sisters would later reunite with him in North America after being liberated from the concentration camps. We'll talk a little bit about the Holocaust today and more so in the next analysis video, but for now we'll just do a quick introduction to Wiesel and some background heading into the history of the Second World War. Wiesel was born in 1928 in Transylvania, Romania, and he was always very well known as both a humanist and a spiritual figure. The humanism, he always said, came from his father, who taught him to read and taught him to study philosophy and to learn to read in Hebrew. And his mother was a spiritualist, turning him towards his Jewish faith and guiding him to read the Torah. And so from a young age, he was a strong reader and a studier in all fields. He was very, very much autodidactic, meaning teaching himself many, many things. When he was young, in 1944, the little village that he lived in, Sikhet, was occupied by the Germans. The Nazi army occupied and forced he and his family and all the Jews in the area to live into the ghetto sections before later that year transferring them to the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camps. And it was here that he spent the rest of the war, in this prison camp, either working or just waiting out his days. The majority of this book, Night, is focused on this time, and particularly the time with he and his father overcoming hardship and dealing with the everyday atrocities of the horror of these camps. After the war, Wiesel taught writing and many other historical Jewish cultural information in all different capacities. And he taught for a while before he went specifically into writing. And very early on, it's kind of sort of ironic since he's well known for this now, but very early on he did not want to write specifically about the Holocaust nor his Holocaust experience. And I'll mention this on the next video, but he was driven to write about this by being inspired by a French literature Nobel recipient who encouraged him to write about his experience. And so eventually he put this large, very large memoir together based on his youth and based on this experience. And he wrote it first in Yiddish, and then it was later translated into French. And then in 1960 it was translated and truncated, meaning shortened, into the version you have in front of you called Night. This was the first English version of his memoir. And when I say truncated, believe the first version that he wrote in Yiddish was somewhere close to 800 or 900 pages, and now it's been brought down to this. When it was published in the U.S. in 1960, strangely enough, as widespread as it is now, it was a very slow seller. It was very much perhaps a victim of its time, being something that people did not want to hear or study right at that time. But then, over time, he begins to be a consistent voice of witness, and up till now, the book has been published all over the world, 30-some different languages, millions and millions of copies, and in 2006 was part of the very popular and very successful Oprah Book Club series, which will guarantee notoriety across many different facets of the world. Wiesel moved to the United States in 1955, so 10 years or so after being liberated from the camps, and became a citizen. And he and his sisters, as I mentioned, were reunited, and some of them moved to Canada and other parts of North America. 1986, he was awarded the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, rather, for speaking out against racism. And to this day continues human rights work, and has been involved on the global stage in a lot of different commentaries on the pursuant Jewish experience. He traveled back to Auschwitz for the first time in 2006, went with Oprah. He said this would be the last time he wanted to go there, he thought. And then in 2009, he went to Buchenwald with President Obama and German Chancellor Angela Merkel at the time. So he's a very well-known figure in regards to Holocaust history and Jewish ethnicity throughout the world. Now I'm going to give you just a little bit of information on the Holocaust. Most of us are well aware of the horrors. I should introduce this section, though, by mentioning the widespread worldwide phenomenon that is denial of the Holocaust. This is a very real issue throughout the world. The Holocaust is one of the most well-documented historical atrocities of the 20th century, and throughout the world there are many people who feel that it was exaggerated, all the way up to being complete fabrication. So this is something to know and to understand. And in fact, late 2007, I believe, Wiesel was actually attacked by somebody who believed that the Holocaust did not happen, and was outwardly attacking Wiesel for promoting this fiction, as he called it. So the Holocaust of the Jewish people in Europe, carried out by the Nazis before and during World War II, so beginning really in the 30s and ending in 1945 with the liberation of the concentration camps. Mostly the Holocaust was directed at the Jewish people, but it also included Poles, Romanians, Soviets, disabled people, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witness, etc. This was a long list of targeted people by this persecution. The concentration camps, which were spread out through different parts of Europe behind the German lines, this is where Jews could work until their deaths, basically. They would put them to work, and they would be weakened and ultimately would die because of starvation or malnutrition in these camps. Later, there would go on to be camps that were extermination camps, specifically for ridding the world of the Jews slowly and methodically, especially the ones who were deemed to be either too old, too young, or unuseful in a lot of ways. If you look into Wiesel's introduction in the first part of the book, which you're going to want to read, he mentions a moment where, towards the end of the war, the urgency for the Nazis to exterminate the Jews on a grander level sped up, and they would actually line Jews up outside of graves that had just been recently dug and mow them down methodically with machine guns and then toss them into these mass graves, sort of hurrying along the work they had been doing for many years, knowing that the end was coming. Of course, we now know that this is a word called genocide, and the murder or the extermination of a particular group of people. That's what genocide means. Along with this, as a bit of a tangent, there was, in these camps and in other places as well, experimentation done by a man known as his name was Dr. Joseph Mengele, who was known for being very sadistic in terms of his experimental approaches to medical and chemical and physically surgical alterations and torturous sort of experiments on the Jewish people and others of the targeted populations. Just very, very horrible things, and I won't even go into them here, but just understand that they were methods that eventually led to either physical, mental, or horrible deformations, or more than likely death. And victims were almost always killed in the extermination chambers by gas chambers, crematoriums, or, as I mentioned, being simply mowed down by these death squads of machine-gunned soldiers. Auschwitz was probably the most famous of the extermination camps. There were 5 others as well. And these were the camps that were specifically for killing off and weeding out the Jews. The first of these camps, spread out throughout Europe, was reached in 1944, and Auschwitz was reached in 1945. And it wasn't until 1944 that the world first becomes aware of this concentrated effort to exterminate the Jewish people on this grand level. It seems kind of interesting now to think about the majority of the Second World War and its portrayal in the media at the time, without knowing the full extent of what's going on to the Jewish people until the war is virtually almost over. So that any sort of heroic notions we would have about the Allied forces, fighting against Nazi Germany because they're exterminating Jews in these massive extermination camps, that really wasn't the case. And of course, that's something we probably already know. But now, if we have a date where we know that 1944 is the real first revelation of these camps outside of Europe, in a large scale, there's empirical proof in front of you. That was 1944. There were rumors and there were stories, and many of Europe knew that if you were carted off to camps throughout the continent, you knew what kind of was going on there. And this is what ultimately Wiesel chose to write about. And he, as I mentioned, did not want to write about it. He survived it. He talks very much about being a witness to these things. He talks very much about being affected personally, but his decision to write is largely based on the need to not have this happen again, and to deny it. He says, to not speak it, to not write it, is to almost deny its existence, and he did not want that to happen. And so in 1952, he was approached by a famous French writer who urged him to write these things down and to let the world know. And so he began to write what would become our English translation known as Night.